Hi everyone, welcome to the workshop. And this is Fatima Taj. She's a software engineer at Yelp, and she's going to host a workshop to tell you all about the secrets of the tech industry and what to do and what not to do on a tech interview. Over to you, Fatima.
Perfect. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, it's perfect.
Okay, perfect. Uh okay. Hi everyone. My name is Fatima and I'll be conducting this workshop on what they don't tell you about technical interviews. So a little bit about myself. I currently work at Yelp as a software engineer. I've been at Yelp for a little over a year now. And it was actually my move over to Yelp that inspired this workshop because as I was going through technical interviews myself, I felt that there's a lot more that goes into your success in a technical interview other than just your knowledge of data structures and algorithms. And yeah, that is what I hope to shed some light on through this workshop. Just a quick disclaimer before we move ahead that this workshop isn't sponsored by Yelp and any opinions or views expressed are held exclusively by myself. So this is what like a rough outline is. We're gonna go very chronologically. It's going to be very end to end. I'm going to start off with like the pre-interview stage where you're just starting to reach out to recruiters and you're networking. Then I'm going to talk about the actual interview, and then in the post-interview stage I'm going to talk about things like compensation and negotiation. So if that's something that you're interested in, please stay tuned. um oh, Okay, so I'm going to start off with the pre-interview stage, and in the pre-interview stage, I don't want to get into any of the prerequisites. So I'm not going to talk about what a good resume looks like because, honestly, that could be a separate workshop altogether. I want to talk more about the art of networking during COVID because the pandemic has really changed the recruiting landscape, right? Like recruiting doesn't look the same way that it looked like 2 to 3 years ago. In the pre-pandemic world, we were used to in-person interactions with our recruiters, and you would meet them in person through either hackathons or conferences, other tech events, or they would come to your campuses to conduct info sessions and things of that sort. But obviously, now that everything is done virtually, how do you go about networking in this virtual world that we live in now? And to get that conversation started, I want to first talk about your elevator pitch, which is this brief introduction that you prepare for yourself. As the name implies, it should be effective enough to catch someone's attention in the same amount of time as an elevator ride. So, ideally, it should be short and sweet, but effective nonetheless. Now, a couple of tips for your elevator pitch. First of all, please be genuine. I think that if you're genuine, your enthusiasm and passion really shows. And I also say this because keep in mind that recruiters deal with a lot of people on a daily basis. So they're pretty good at figuring out whether or not someone is or isn't being completely honest about either their past experiences or their skill set. Secondly, express genuine interest in the company. Like, really sit down and think about why you want to work for a given company. Is it the engineering culture? Is it the product itself that really excites you? Is it the culture of innovation, mentorship? Whatever it is, I highly encourage you to think long and hard about this question. For a couple of reasons. Number one, this is a fairly typical question that you're going to be asked, and you're actually going to be asked this question repeatedly. Your recruiter is most likely going to ask you this question in the initial HR screening rounds, and then even in later parts of the interview process, this question is bound to come up. So I think that the earlier you start thinking about this, the better off you're going to be. Secondly, as someone who's conducted a lot of interviews myself, you won't believe the number of candidates that come into interviews having not a clue what the company does that they're interviewing for, and obviously that doesn't reflect the most positively on you, right? It just makes you seem very disinterested in the whole thing, and it just tells me that um, you're not really like invested in this company. You probably just saw the opening, you went ahead and applied, and you didn't bother giving it a second thought. So it's not the best reflection on you. Now, when I say that, do your research about a company, by no means am I saying that, oh, you should know what their last quarter's EPS earnings were. But at the very least, go to their website, read up on their mission statement, read up on their values, just so you have something unique that you can bring to the table in terms of your response to this question. So I'll give you an example of how I like to typically address this question. I like to talk about the three unique things in my response to this question. So in the first part, I talk about the technical appeal of the company. So if I were to join this company? How would they help me improve my technical skill set as a software engineer? In the second part, I talk about the cultural appeal. So are there any parts of the culture that I've either like heard about or read about that I really like and I would want to be a part of? In the third part, I talk about like particular initiatives that the company might have like done in the past or they're currently doing that I've really liked, or they've really resonated with me. So to give you a quick example, when I was interviewing with Yelp for the third part of my response, I said that I really liked the way Yelp responded to small businesses when the pandemic hit. I do like to tell people that the third part is kind of optional. Obviously, this is the part where you're gonna have to like really dig down into a company, right? This is the part where you have to do the most amount of work. But I do think that if you do the third part well, you will really walk away from the interview being a very memorable candidate. Like I'm for sure going to remember you because I'll remember that okay, this person like was really really invested in this company. Um, then moving on this slide, you see two screenshots of messages that I sent to to a recruiter and then to a friend of mine during my most recent job hunt, which was like a year ago. The whole the motivation behind the slide is to basically demonstrate how you should tailor your approach based on the person it is that you're reaching out to. So I'll start off with the one on the left, which is just a message that I sent to a recruiter on LinkedIn. Now, I think that as far as recruiters are concerned, it's perfectly okay for you to be like very straight to the point. You don't need to sugarcoat your message. Don't need to beat around the bush. Just get straight to the point. Also, again, like, be mindful of a recruiter's time because, just like you are reaching out to a recruiter, there's likely hundreds of other people reaching out to the very same recruiter at the very same time. So as far as recruiters are concerned, just be very like concise and very well organized with, the message that you're sending them. I think like a good template that I always suggest is, quickly start off by introducing yourself, then mention the exact opening or the exact posting that you're interested in, quickly talk about why you think you would be a good fit for that opening, and then lastly, always include your resume for further reference. So I think that's like a good enough template as far as recruiters are concerned. Moving to the screenshot on the right, that's a Facebook message that I sent to a former colleague of mine, and I was hoping that they could refer me for an opportunity at their company. Now, I do think that as far as people within your network are concerned, your approach should be a bit different because ultimately you share a different relationship with these people and you don't want to make them feel like you're just using them as a means to an end, right? So try not to make the conversation sound too transactional. Now I know that as far as like people of this nature are concerned, it can be a bit awkward reaching out to them, especially virtually, right? Like especially if it's someone that you haven't chatted with in a long time. Let's say you went to school with them, you haven't chatted with them in like over 4 years, and now you want to work at their company, right? It can be a bit awkward reaching out to them out of the blue. Something that I think always works is that you can just reach out to these people and ask them to have like a quick virtual coffee chat with you. I think that's like a great way to break the ice. And in this conversation, try to get them to talk about themselves. Okay. Try to ask them questions about their work, about what their day to day looks like interesting projects that they worked on, what parts of the company they enjoy, what parts of the company culture that they enjoy or not enjoy, right? Try to get them basically like the crux is that try to make the conversation about them, and then over the course of that conversation you can slowly maneuver it into asking them to refer you. Also keep in mind that these people are the best opportunity that you have to get to know both the pros and the cons of working at a given company, right? A recruiter on the other hand, obviously that's no fault of their own. A recruiter's job is to get as big of a talent pool as possible for a company, right? So a recruiter might paint you like a very one-sided picture of what it is to work at a company, right? They might not be very transparent about like things that the company might be struggling with or like issues that they've been recently dealing with. These people on the other hand might be able to give you like a much more objective opinion of what it is to work at that company, right? So again, just something to keep in mind. Then another very popular question that I get is how many jobs you should be applying to. Sadly, there's no magical number. Applying to jobs is kind of like the cycle that you have to be in until you find the best match for yourself. But I do have a couple of tips as far as this is concerned. First of all, really try to harness the power of platforms like LinkedIn, Glassdoor, etc. I've used both of these platforms very successfully. I got an internship off of Glassdoor, and then I got my most recent job off of LinkedIn. Secondly, as far as the process of applying to jobs is concerned, there's no denying that like it's a very monotonous, very like repetitive sort of a process, right? Like all it is you're going through jobs, you're shortlisting the ones that you're interested in, you're filling out the same fields over and over again, you're uploading your resume. It could quickly get very overwhelming and just very monotonous, right? So I've kind of experimented with both ends of the spectrum as far as that process is concerned, in the sense that I've been the person who used to sit down like every Sunday. I would go through like thousands and thousands of openings and I would apply to the ones that I was interested in. I wouldn't recommend going about it this way because, first of all, I think it's a very, very inefficient use of your time, right? Obviously, if you're going through that many openings, you're not going to be done within like an hour. It's likely going to take you a couple of hours. Secondly, just because of the sheer number of postings that you have to get through, there's a pretty good chance that you might skip out on a couple of really good ones. So yeah, I wouldn't recommend going about it that way. What I would recommend is that try to make this into a part of your daily routine. Okay, so try to make this into something that you do every single day. Like every day, just set aside anywhere between 30 to 45 minutes where you just apply to jobs. Okay, now there's very handy filters on like all of these platforms that allow you to filter jobs that have been posted within the last 24 hours. Apply that filter and just quickly go through that list. I think this is a much like efficient way of going about it because, first of all, like you're time boxing yourself, right? So you're not going to spend hours and hours doing this every day. Secondly, I think it also really helps just from like the mental aspect of this. Like there's a huge mental component as far as applying to jobs is concerned, right? At least for me, when I'm looking for a new job, this is something that always weighs on my head that, oh, okay, I have to apply to jobs. Oh, okay, I have to be consistent with this, right? So I think when you make this into something that you are doing every single day, it really takes that mental pressure off of you. Yeah, it just it helps you be more consistent with the whole thing. And I always tell this to people that like applying to jobs is all about consistency. It is a numbers game. The more consistent you are, the better off your chances are going to be. Okay, so now I'm going to start talking about the actual interview. And before I do that, I'm going to give you a quick overview of what the interview structure is like, at least as it applies to like, quote unquote, big tech companies. Obviously, this can look a lot different for medium sized or like smaller companies, but you'll see common elements in all of them. So it starts off with a recruiter reaching out to you with either a phone screen or an online coding assessment. In some cases, you can also get a take home assignment. Now, I've personally never seen like a big tech company give a take home assignment. Big tech companies usually have very standardized tech processes, and they like to stick to those processes. So yeah, they'll either do like a phone screen interview all day, or they'll do like an online coding assessment. Take home assignments I have found are truer for startups. I personally am not a fan of take home assignments at all. I think that the amount of effort that you put into them is absolutely not worth what you get out of it. But, just so you're aware. Then, depending on the outcome of this first round, there can be either a small behavioral round or another live technical coding round. Now, if it's a behavioral round, it will be with an EM or an engineering manager. And the purpose of this would be to assess a cultural fit. If it's a live technical interview round, then it's just like this, right? Like they'll just be like an engineer on a call with you, and you'll have to code your solution live. Then, lastly, you make it to your on-site, which is like in the pre-pandemic world, the on-site used to be the part where the company would fly you out to their headquarters, and you would basically spend an entire day in interviews. But in the virtual world that we live in now, this is also conducted virtually. This is anywhere between 4 to 6 hours. There can be, 4 to 6 rounds in here. It varies a lot by company. It's a combination of technical, behavioral, and system design rounds. There can be anywhere between 2 to 3 technical rounds, 1 system design, and 1 to 2 behavioral rounds. To give you a couple of examples, my on-site with Amazon was 5 hours long. There were 5 rounds in total. Each round was anywhere between 45 to 50 minutes. Amazon does something called like a hybrid sort of a round, which means that each round is a combination of behavioral and technical questions. So the first 10 to 15 minutes would be spent on behavioral questions, and then the rest of the time they would spend asking me technical questions. But I've also interviewed with other companies where they've had dedicated rounds that were either behavioral or technical in nature, which is something that Yelp did. But again, like I said, you can see a lot of variation here. Another thing that I want to mention is that not every company might do this, but some companies might give you the option to split your on-site across 2 days. Again, like I said, not every company is going to do this. Twitter was one of those companies that gave me this flexibility. But I just mentioned this because I think that, let's say you're very concerned about your on-site and you think, that it's too overwhelming, or you might not be able to give it your best shot in one go. This is always something that you can bring up to your recruiter. Speaking of your recruiter is your primary point of contact for like during this entire process. So as you move to your on-site, they'll inform you of like the logistics of what your on-site will look like, which includes like the structure of the interviews, the duration, the names of the interviewers, etc. And they'll also most likely set up a chat with you to give you an opportunity to ask questions. And I highly encourage you to use this chat to ask them anything that will put you at ease during the interview. So this includes things like how will the technical rounds be conducted? Are you expected to write production level code or pseudocode? Okay, what sort of like a coding platform will they be using? Right? Like, is it going to be something like HackerRank or CoderPad, or can you use like an IDE of your choice? When you can expect to hear back after the interview, you can ask them about how the system design rounds will be conducted. Like, can you use like a virtual whiteboard, or can you write things down on your own notepad and kind of hold it up for your interview to see? You can even ask them like, what level you're being considered for. Now, as far as like, let's say figuring out all these different these questions is concerned, I know it might sound very trivial to you right now, right? Like you might be thinking that, oh, why does it matter if, what if how I'm going to be coding my solution, as long as I know how to code my solution. But it does make a difference. Like, I think like something that I feel is that with technical interviews, there's already so many unknowns to it, right? There's so many things that you don't know. You don't know what sort of questions are coming your way, right? You don't know if you're going to be able to answer those questions successfully. So there's already like a lot of unknowns here, right? And obviously because of all those unknowns, that's why there's so much anxiety that we have about technical interviews. So I think that if going into your interview you try to figure out as many of these unknowns as possible, the better off like you're going to be, the more kind of relaxed you're going to be heading into your interviews. A couple of notes here. If you're using like a virtual whiteboard, like say you're using something like a Google Jamboard, please just make sure that you're like, you've used it before. Just like try to get comfortable with like the different features and all of that. Okay, moving on. Now I'm going to start talking about the actual interview. I'm going to start off with the behavioral parts of the interview. Now I have like a very interesting sort of a history as far as behavioral interviews are concerned, because for the longest time, I used to think that behavioral interviews were like the easy part of the whole interview process. Like I used to think that, oh, this is, it's just a conversation that you have with your interviewer. So like, how bad can it really be? And it's a conversation, so it should come fairly naturally. And why on earth should I like prepare to have a conversation with someone, right? It should be like a fairly organic sort of a situation. Let me tell you right off the bat that that is an incredibly misguided way of going about it, because your behavioral interviews are as important as your technical interviews. They're there for a reason. They're not filler rounds. And through your behavioral interviews, your interviewers are looking for certain signals from you as the candidate. Now, once you start reading up about technical interviews, you'll hear this term signals being thrown around a lot. Signal basically refers to like certain key traits that interviewers are looking from you as the candidate. So this includes things like, oh, does the candidate communicate well? Does the candidate know how to collaborate with other people? Is the candidate receptive to feedback, or does the candidate get like very defensive about it, right? So these are all certain signals that you're actively being assessed on in an interview setting. Now, the list that you see here, these are just some very typical questions that you can expect to be asked in a behavioral interview. At the very least, please just make sure that you can answer questions of this nature. Obviously, there can be a lot more variations, but like these are like some central themes that you're always going to be asked about. As far as your responses to behavioral questions are concerned, first of all, please be honest. Do not fabricate experiences because you will most likely be caught. It's okay to do minor modifications here and there, but please don't share something that's completely fictitious. And the reason why I say that is because interviewers always ask follow-up questions. So let's say I ask you a question and you weren't well prepared to answer that question. So you just quickly came up with something on the spot and you shared it with me. Now, the conversation isn't going to end there. What I'm going to do as the interviewer is that I'm going to listen to what you had to say and I'm going to pick at like specific elements from your response and I'm going to ask you about it. So, in that follow up cross examination that happens, if you're unable to answer my questions, I'm likely going to figure out that, you're either not being completely honest or you just weren't well prepared to answer this question. Obviously, you don't want your interviewer to be thinking either of those two things about you. So, as far as behavioral questions are concerned, please always be honest. Secondly, be a good storyteller, and one of the very really nice ways of going about that is to use the star format. I'm not going to delve into the details of this format. Definitely look this up on your own time, but I will say that this is a very widely used popular format within the tech industry. In fact, before my on-site with Amazon, they actually sent me a handout where they specifically mentioned that we really like it if our candidates use the star format to structure their responses to behavioral questions. Next, for each category that I showed you on the previous slide, prepare at least more than one experience. And I say this because a lot of these questions are actually going to be repeated by your interviewers. Like they might change the wording around a bit, but like the central theme of the question will stay the same. So to avoid sounding like too repetitive, and to avoid rinsing and repeating the same story over and over again, I think it's always better if you go into your interviews having thought of multiple experiences or multiple scenarios that you can share with your interviewers. Next, show what you've learned from your experiences, even if they were failures. And the reason why I included this point here is because that I know for a lot of candidates, questions that have to do with like failures or setbacks or weaknesses can be a bit scary, right? And it's very easy to think that, oh, maybe these are meant to be trick questions. I can assure you that they're not. They're not trick questions. However, there is a trick to answering them. And the trick is that there's basically three things that you want to keep in mind when you're answering questions of this nature. First, obviously, share your experience. Then, quickly talk about what you learned from that experience. And lastly, talk about how you change your ways moving forward from that experience. If you have these three elements to your response, you're basically showing the interviewer that you've come full circle. And that is the trick. That's all. That's all you need to keep in mind. Think of it this way: at the end of the day, what is a failure? Like any failure that you experience, it gives you an opportunity to learn from, to grow from, right? It helps you identify something that you were lacking in, and it gives you an opportunity to improve upon it. And that is exactly the kind of insight and the kind of introspection that your interviewer expects to hear in your response to this question. Lastly, if you're asked a question that you don't have an answer to right away, you can ask your interviewer if you can have 1 to 2 minutes to think about it. I actually wasn't aware that you could do this, but I have done this and this is perfectly okay. However, I will say that keep in mind that interview rounds are anywhere between 45 minutes to an hour. So obviously, you can't be thinking about a question for 5 to 10 minutes at end. Even if you are, your interviewer will just move you on to the next question. However, if you do need like a couple of seconds or 1 to 2 minutes just to kind of structure a response in your head, it's perfectly okay for you to take that time. Okay, so moving to the technical parts of the interview. Again, like I said in the beginning, the purpose of this workshop is not for me to tell you the data structures or algorithms you should know to be successful in your technical interviews. I think there's a plethora of resources available that can probably guide you a lot better than I can. What I want to talk about is the optimal strategy that you should have for your technical interviews. To start off, please keep in mind that questions are kept purposefully vague and it is your job to clarify, because being a good software engineer isn't just about churning code 24/7, right? There's a lot of other aspects to your job, and one of like a very important aspect of your job is your ability to do requirements gathering. Now, what that means is basically your ability to ask good, meaningful, insightful questions, how you deal with, vague specifications in the question prompt, Think of it this way: like if I'm the consumer, right, and you're the engineer, and I come to you and I ask you that, hey, I want to design this website, right? What are you going to do? You're going to start asking me questions, right? You're going to ask me, oh, okay, what kind of website do you want? What sort of colors do you want? What sort of features or functionality do you want, right? You're going to do that initial investigative work, and that is exactly what I mean when I talk about requirements gathering. So to give you a quick example, let's say an interviewer asks you, for an input X, do Y. The first thing that you should do is that you should clarify what input X is. Is it a string? Is it a list? Is it an integer? That's on you. Okay. That's something that you actively need to do in a technical interview. Don't jump into the question if you haven't like clarified any assumptions, if you haven't talked about any of like the corner or edge cases. Write down test cases, specifically corner or edge cases. And I say this very early on because I know that as software engineers, we tend to have like this horrible tendency to not think about testing, right? Like we don't enjoy thinking about testing. We try to put it off as much as we can, but you can't do that in a technical interview. In a technical interview, you need to show your interviewer that you're thinking about testing even before you started working on your solution. So what you should do is that you should identify the corner or edge cases, list them, and then quickly work with your interviewer to see what the expected test outcome should be. Now, this is a very useful exercise for you to do because this will also validate whether you've understood the question as intended, right? You don't want to be in a situation where you understand a question a certain way, you didn't bother clarifying your understanding, you dove right into the solution, and 45 minutes later you realize that, oh, I didn't even understand the question as it was intended, right? At that point it's too late, you're not going to get another opportunity. So this is a very useful exercise to do before you start working on your solution. At this point, the stage is set. You can now start working on your solution. But as you work through it, please remember to communicate efficiently, effectively, and very clearly. Okay, that is extremely important for your success in a technical interview. Talk things out loud. Discuss trade-offs, different strategies that you're considering, etc. Please don't be that person who goes off into their corner and they're silent for the next 20 to 30 minutes. I can assure you that even if you have the best solution out there, you will not be able to pass that interview round because the interviewer will have no insight into what your process was, right? They don't know what your strategy was, they don't know what your approach was, and that is exactly what a technical interview is all about. It is meant for you to showcase your approach to questions, right? It's meant to showcase your approach to problems. They basically want to see that, okay, how does this person approach a problem from the point that they're given a prompt all the way to delivering like basically a product, right? So that's exactly what they want to see. And there's no way that you can showcase them that if you're not communicating effectively. Okay. So if there's anything that you take away from this workshop, please let it be the importance and like the undeniable importance of efficient, effective, and clear communication. If you're stuck, you can ask for help. But again, there's a caveat here, and the caveat is that you can only ask for help provided that you've been communicating well up to that point. If you've been silent for the past 20 minutes, even if your interviewer wants to help you, they won't be able to help you out, right? Because like they have no insight into what you're struggling with, right? Another great benefit of effective communication is that if the interviewer feels that you're going too off track, they'll actually stop you right there and they'll nudge you towards the right direction. So, overall, you'll end up saving yourself a lot of time, and time is of the essence in a technical interview. Next, not every interviewer will allow you to compile your code and see if the test cases pass. And again, this goes back to the point that I was making earlier about testing. I know that on our own time, let's say if you're working on like a very challenging lead code problem, and you're almost there, but you still have a couple of test cases that are failing. So what you do is you make a little change, you hit the run button. There's still a couple of failures, so you make a little change, you hit the run button again, and you get into this loop of like making a change, hitting the run button, making a change, hitting the run button, right? Now, I call this the abuse of the run button, and you cannot, under any circumstances, do this within a technical interview because this shows your interviewer two things about you. One, it shows them that you do not have the debugging abilities to figure out what the problem with your logic is. And then, secondly, It shows them that you rely on automated testing to tell you what the problem is. And you do not want your interviewer to be thinking either of those two things about you. So, going back to the optimal strategy that I was talking about, once you're done working on your solution, what you're going to do is that you're going to using the test cases that you identified earlier, you're going to step through your code line by line. And when I say line by line, I mean by line by line. Right now, it might sound like trivially easy. I can assure you that it's not. In an actual interview setting, it's actually pretty challenging to step through your code line by line. I say this because, again, this is a very useful activity for you to do because it'll help you identify like logical errors in your code, and even if there's like little syntax errors here and there. But yeah, at the very least, this is a very important activity that a very important step that you need to showcase to your interviewer. For your system design rounds, draw diagrams or class diagrams if the question is about object oriented design. And this is because they want to see what your understanding is of how the different components in the system are interconnected. Now, for the purposes of this session, I'm not going to delve into the details of system design. Honestly, that could be like a separate workshop altogether. I will say a couple of, I do want to say a couple of things about them. Now, as far as your intern interviews are concerned, there's likely not going to be a design component to your interviews. But anything like new grad and any roles after that, there's for sure going to be a design component. As a new grad, like you might get like an object oriented design sort of a question. So it could be something like, oh, design a parking lot or design like a elevator system, right? So you might not get like a full blown system design question, but you can definitely get some sort of like a variation of it. So if you're unaware, system design questions are basically like very high level design questions. They can be things like, oh, design like Google Drive or design like Facebook Messenger, right? The point of these questions is not for you to like talk about the low level implementation details. It's more to talk about like the high level concepts, right? So for example, what sort of database choices will you be making? What sort of caching mechanisms, if any, will be in place? How will you scale the system as traffic increases, right? Things like that. So yeah, the like what I want to like really stress on is that don't underestimate system design rounds or any design round for that matter, because these aren't like, I think these prove to be an Achilles heel for a lot of candidates, because this isn't really something that we're taught as undergrads, right? Like no one knows how to scale design systems at scale as an undergrad, right? So yeah, my suggestion would just be that don't underestimate these rounds. Lastly, if you're very nervous about your technical rounds, I would advise you to watch real life technical interview videos. This is something that I did, and it was honestly really helpful. I think at this point, technical interviews definitely have a reputation, right? They have this reputation of being very scary and overwhelming and challenging. Like every time I open LinkedIn, there's like 20 different people talking about how different their interview experiences have been. Secondly, I think that when we go into these interviews, we go in expecting perfection from ourselves. Like we go in thinking that we cannot afford to be anything less than perfect. And if we are, we're not going to get that offer. And that could not be further from the truth, because no one is expecting perfection from you in a technical interview or any interview for that matter. Because at the end of the day, an interview is an interaction between two human beings. So, by the very nature of that, there's bound to be like little issues, little mistakes that you make here and there. And most of those mistakes are forgivable mistakes. So, for example, a lot of people stutter when they're nervous. I do that. It's perfectly okay for you to do that. It's okay to be stuck. It's okay to ask for help. It's okay not to have the right answer right away, right? Those are all very forgivable mistakes. So, I think watching these videos, watching like actual people and how they perform and react in like an actual real life, like interview setting, I think it just kind of helped humanize the whole process for me. Okay, so in the post interview stage, I'm going to first quickly give you an overview of how hiring committees work, because I think that as candidates, we tend to lack an understanding of what happens behind the scenes once we're done our interviews. And because of that lack of understanding, we tend to assume the worst, right? Like if we assume that, oh, just because we're not hearing back immediately after our interviews, we've probably been rejected, and that might not necessarily be true. So once you're done your interviews, your recruiter puts together this package for you that includes your resume or any code samples that you submitted, and then feedback from all the interviewers that met you. This package is then sent over to the hiring committee, which makes the final decisions as to whether or not an offer is going to be extended to a candidate or not. Now, the frequency at which hiring committees meet can be very different based on the company. So, for some companies, they can meet as often as two to three times a week. So, obviously, with those companies, the turnaround time is going to be very quick. But yeah, like I said, this can really vary based on the company. So that's why there might be a little gap between once you finish your interviews and once you hear back about the results of your interviews. Now, in case you're rejected, obviously that's not an outcome that any candidate wants, but I do think that there is a professional way of addressing it instead of just, reading that email and then, just sending it off to your junk folder. Thank your recruiter, and if company policy allows, you can ask them for feedback. Now, bigger companies usually have explicit policies because of which they are unable to share feedback, but like smaller companies are usually pretty okay with it. I personally asked two of the companies that I interviewed with for feedback, and they were very gracious enough to share it with me. And obviously, that feedback is extremely invaluable. In case you accept the offer, that's perfect. Still thank your recruiter. But if you do have interviews scheduled with other companies, please respectfully let them know of your decision. Don't waste anyone's time. Don't ghost them. Same thing applies if you reject the offer. Thank your recruiter. And I think that, like, in all scenarios, irrespective of whatever the outcome of your interview is, it's always better never to shut the door completely on a given company unless you saw some explicit red flags in your interviews with them. I think it's always better to propose staying connected for future opportunities, because this way not only does your network continue to grow, but the next time that you're in the job market, you'll have some solid places to start from. And yeah, this is just an email that I sent out to a company that I was no longer interested in interviewing with. Don't worry about taking a picture or anything. I'll share the slide deck afterwards, but you're absolutely free to use this email template if you want. Okay, so this is the last and final part of my presentation. This is something that I love talking about. I'm very passionate about this, and that's for a couple of reasons. Firstly, I think there is a huge lack of awareness as far as the importance of negotiating your offer is concerned. Secondly, I think that, even for people who do know, I think there's a lot of awkwardness around this conversation as well. It's not really like a fun conversation to have. It can be pretty awkward once you get to that stage. um so I'll tell you what my personal experience has been. I actually knew about the importance of negotiating your offer, like, from like a very long time ago, right? I had like a lot of my seniors that had told me that, oh, you should never accept the first number that the company throws your way. Always, you should always try to negotiate. I knew all of that. But when it was time for me to actually negotiate, I just chickened out of it. I think I just got so insecure, and I was just so unsure of myself and what I was bringing to the table, and whether, the compensation that I was asking for, whether it was completely justified, that I didn't even bother negotiating. And and I can tell you that I regretted that decision so bad for the next 2 years of working at that company. So, to help you avoid a similar situation, I'm going to quickly talk about compensation and negotiation in tech. Before I do that, I just want to quickly give you an overview of what typical compensation packages in tech are like, because they can usually have a lot more components than what we're typically used to. So there's a base salary, which is usually the most difficult to negotiate. Then there's your restricted stock units, or your RSUs. This is basically just company equity. But what you need to understand with your RSUs is the vesting schedule. So your RSUs basically hold no monetary value to you unless they have vested. Okay. So companies usually follow a 4-year vesting schedule. And what that means is that every year, 25% of your RSUs will vest. So let's say that, tomorrow you sign a contract with the company, and they grant you 100K worth of RSUs. At the time that you have signed the contract, the RSUs hold like no financial value to you. Okay. They hold no monetary value. However, after your first 1 year anniversary of working at that company, 25% of your RSUs will vest. And at this point, these are just like company shares. So, you can choose to do whatever you want with them. You can sell them, you can decide to sell them at a later time. It's completely up to you. But yeah, just as far as your RSUs are concerned, just make sure that you understand what the vesting schedule is at your company. Then there's a yearly bonus. This is again pretty standard. It's a set percentage of your base salary, and this is prorated. And what that means is that if you have worked at a company for half a year, your yearly bonus will be half of what it would have been if you had worked there the entire year. Now, something that I want to say here is that I've seen a lot of variation as far as yearly bonuses are concerned. I used to work for fintech earlier, like I was working for a trading firm, and fintech is actually kind of notorious for having like astronomical yearly bonuses. Like at my previous company, the yearly bonus could be anywhere between 10 to 20% of your base salary, which is a lot. But I've also worked for companies that, where the yearly bonus is as small as like 2.5% of your base salary, which is basically next to nothing. So yeah, you can see a lot of variation there. And lastly, there's a signing bonus, and this is usually where you have the most room to negotiate. However, do keep in mind that a signing bonus is a one-time thing, and you only get it in your first year of working at that company. Now, as far as research about compensation numbers is concerned, obviously talk to your friends, talk to friends across a wide variety of industries, just so you have a better idea of what the market might be willing to offer you. As far as resources available online are concerned, I actually wouldn't recommend Glassdoor. I would recommend something like levels.fyi. It's a lot more reliable. It breaks down salaries into like these different components that we just talked about, and also shows you how salaries differ based on location. So keep in mind that you could be working for the exact same company in the exact same team, but you could be making something very different if you're, say, based in San Francisco versus, say, Toronto versus London. So Levels offers you that sort of a transparency as well. Next, never accept an offer as soon as it's presented. It can be very tempting to do so, but please resist the urge to do so. Your recruiter will likely call you to discuss the compensation package. At this time, just jot down the details, thank them, ask them for how long you have to accept the offer, and that's it. And I say the last part because offers in tech are called exploding offers, and this is usually because you don't have a lot of time to accept the offer, usually like a week or maybe 10 days. So it's always better to have like a tentative timeline in mind. If asked, never be the first one to share a number or a range. Okay. In North America, it's perfectly okay for you to like politely refuse to answer that sort of a question. And this is a question that I can promise you you're going to be asked a lot. Okay. Even in like the very initial like HR screening interviews that you're going to do, your recruiter is for sure going to ask you that, oh, what are your salary expectations? You are not obligated to answer that question. You can just politely decline. You can be like, hey, I'm sorry, I'm not comfortable answering that question, or could I get back to you after I've done some market research. Alternatively, you can also flip the question on them, and you can ask them that, oh, what would someone in this position with my experience be making at your company? Next, I got a lot of advice in terms of how you should go about negotiating. So whether you should call your recruiter or whether you should email them. Ultimately, obviously, it depends on whatever you're more comfortable with. But I decided to email my recruiter. Again, I was just very awkward about the whole thing, and I kind of feared that if I call my recruiter, maybe they'll get me to agree on the initial numbers that the company was putting forward. So I was more comfortable at the prospect of sending them an email. In your follow up conversation, always thank them for extending the offer to you. And at this point, you should have concrete numbers ready and mention any competing offers or deadlines. However, please never lie to a recruiter about competing offers or compensation, because not only are recruiters very well connected, they can also ask you to submit proof of competing offers and or compensation. And lastly, recruiters really like it if you convey that you'll be ready to sign the contract immediately if they can get to your proposed numbers. And just to kind of demonstrate, this is the email that I sent out when I was trying to negotiate. Just going back to what I was saying about like how awkward this conversation can be. I know this email is just like 5 lines, but I'm very proud of these 5 lines because it took me 30 minutes to come up with them. And I was still so unsure of this email that I sent it to like 5 of my friends to proofread. And only once they had given me the green light did I forward this to my recruiter. I did get like a bump in my compensation after this. So this email does get you results. So you're absolutely free to use this template if you want. There's just two last things that I want to talk about before we end things. One, people ask me if you should negotiate for your internships, and you absolutely can and you absolutely should. There's no rule anywhere that says that you can only negotiate for your full time offers. Obviously, it might be more difficult to negotiate as an intern, but that doesn't mean that it's completely out of the question. I've helped my younger brother negotiate for two of his internships very successfully. Secondly, people ask me if you should try to negotiate even if you don't have any competing offers. And to that, I also say yes, absolutely. There's the keep in mind that the absolute worst thing that can happen if you try to negotiate is that the company will say no. That's it. That's the absolute worst thing that can happen. They won't retract your offer just because you're trying to negotiate a higher salary. So don't ever let that fear stop you from trying to negotiate. At the end of the day, just like anything else, negotiation is a skill. It's not something that you're magically going to know how to do once you get to your full time offers. So I think the earlier you get started, the better it is. Like if you start trying to negotiate at like, when for your internships, I think that hopefully by the time you get to your full time offers, you'll likely have a much better idea of how to navigate this entire conversation. But yeah, this brings me to the end of my workshop. Thank you for attending my session today. If you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them right now. Otherwise, if you want to practice mock interviews, if you want to have your resume critiqued, or even if you just want to have a general chat about working in tech, you can reach out to me through either my email or my LinkedIn. I will share this slide deck in the Discord channel. But yeah, I would also really appreciate if you could fill out this feedback form because it really helps me improve the session for future iterations. But yeah, thank you so much for being such a lovely audience today.
Hi Fatima, thank you so much for presenting. Thanks for particularly sharing the templates, which you've actually used with a lot of companies and it all worked out for you. We really thank you for thanking. We have to thank you for presenting such an invaluable workshop, which everybody is going to benefit from, including myself. In fact, I'm also applying to internships this summer, and this workshop definitely has given me a lot of insights. So we do have a couple of questions in chat. So the first question is from Rohan. How would you quantify your project?
Quantify. Oh, okay, that's a good question. I mean, yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, if there's like, let's say you worked on like some sort of optimization that can be pretty easy to quantify, right? Like for example, if like let's say you were working on like some sort of like a Python project, you can put in timers and you can see how the timing has improved, right? Like if you're talking about, if I understand your question correctly, if you're talking about quantifying your project because obviously you want to mention it on your resume, they don't have to be exact numbers. Like it can be like a rough approximate range as well. But I will say though that please don't come up with like just random numbers, okay? Like especially if the number is like really astronomical. If you're saying that, oh, the performance went up by 200%, that's a huge number. That's a big claim that you're making. So sometimes your interviewer can even ask you that, oh, how did you come up with that number, right? So you should have some idea. Like it should be like a realistic number that you're sharing, and if asked, you should be able to back up that number. um like let's say if you redid like a website, and let's say you want to say that, oh, traffic went up, right? That's, I think that would be fairly easy to track. There's like analytics in place that will allow you to do that. um but yeah, I don't know if I answered your question.
Thank you so much for answering that. And here's another question. If we're stuck on a question, will asking the help of the interviewer hurt our chances of getting employed?
No, absolutely not. I know that's a very big misconception. I'll actually say that the best interviewers out there are the ones who will help you out. In fact, I would say that it's actually a red flag if your interviewer is just like staying silent. Like they can clearly see that you're struggling, but they're just staying silent. That's actually, I would actually consider that a red flag, because an interviewer's job is not to make you feel uncomfortable or like to make you feel like it's a us versus them sort of a situation. It's truly not. An interview is meant to be a collaborative experience. So absolutely not. It's perfectly okay for you to ask for help. Obviously, don't be asking for help like every 2 minutes, right? But like I think the best interviewers out there will actually, like if they feel that you're struggling, they'll actually give you hints. So yeah, don't ever think that just because you're asking for help, it's you're not gonna pass that round. Absolutely not.
All right. Thank you so much. And we have another question. How do you go about different roles in companies and find the one that perfectly fits your skills?
Uh, First of all, I think perfectly is might not be like the right word, because like it's very difficult to find a perfect fit, right? So I think like let's say if we're thinking about it from like applying to a job perspective, I usually, honestly, I think I go for like a maybe like a 50 to 60% fit. If I feel that like I fulfill 50 to 60% of the job description, I will go ahead and apply. I will say though that it's actually a statistic that women are a lot more harder on themselves when it comes to applying to jobs. Like women will try to aim for like a 80 to 90% fit, whereas men will be, pretty comfortable applying even if there's like a 40 to 50% fit. So I will say though that just be a little mindful of this. There's no such thing as a perfect fit, okay? um and also like it's very hard to say exactly what an interview, like a company is looking for. You never know what parts of your resume will stand out for the recruiter, right? Like you don't know, it might be that, oh, you have some sort of like an extracurricular on there, or some sort of like a side project on there that really sticks out for the recruiter, right? And they're like, oh, this makes them a much better candidate than that other person. So I think that as far as applying to jobs is concerned, even if you think you're like a 50% fit with what's in the like job requirements, I would say go ahead and apply. And again, like I always tell myself this, that like what's the worst that'll happen? They won't get back to me, or they'll reject me. Like, is that really the end of the world? No. So it's okay, take your chance.
All right, yeah. And Mukta has a question. How do you follow up with your interviewer on email after the initial technical round?
So what I usually do is that even like while my interviews are being scheduled, I always try to get an estimate on how long it's going to be before I hear back from my interviewer, or my recruiter. I think that's always helpful. It just gives you like a rough kind of timeline in your head. So let's say that I'm scheduling an interview with you, and you ask me about the timeline, right? I tell you that okay, I'll reach back to you within 2 to 3 days of your interview. So what I'll do is that I'll wait 2 to 3 days after my interview. If I don't hear anything back from you, then I'll send you like a reminder email. So I think it's always better if you as the candidate are more proactive about this. Like before going into your interviews, just make sure that you have asked your recruiter when you can roughly expect to hear back.
All right. And we have one last question from Mukta as well. How do we ask for help during the interview? Do we directly ask them for help, or is there any other way of asking?
No, you can just directly ask them for help. You can be like, hey, could I get a hint about this? I think there's an art to asking questions, right? Like if you come up to me and you're like, I need help, versus if you come up to me and you're like, hey, I've done XYZ, I've tried out these ABC approaches, but I'm still struggling. Do you mind helping me out with this? Do you mind giving me a hint? Which approach do you think is better? Like which approach is going to make me more inclined to help you out? It's the latter, right? So I think like it's perfectly okay for you to ask for a hint. It's perfectly okay for you to ask for help. But I think you're always going to be better off if you can kind of quickly summarize everything that you've done so far, like what you've attempted so far, and then ask for help.
All right. Yeah, that is all the questions we have for today. Thank you so much for coming and presenting today. I've learned a lot from this just the past hour. Thank you so much. And
No
also,
worries.
you could share your feedback form on the
Yes.
channel, and we could ask the people to fill it up.
Perfect. Yeah, no, I'll share the slide deck and the feedback form.
Yeah,
But yeah, thank you so much for being such a lovely audience today. And I hope you have a great rest of your weekend.
thank you. And I will definitely reach out to you on email if I have any questions.
For sure. Take
All
care.
right. Thank you so
Bye.
much. Bye bye.